Forget everything you think you know about a wedding. Not the white dress, not the decorated hall, not the slow walk down the aisle while soft music plays and guests dab their eyes with folded napkins. Forget the cake, the rings exchanged with trembling hands, the photographer crouching at the altar trying to capture the exact moment two people become one. That version of marriage, the one printed on invitation cards and rehearsed in romantic films, has almost nothing to do with what marriage looked like in first-century Judea. And yet, somehow, we read the Gospels through that lens. We imagine the wedding at Cana as a quaint celebration among friends. We picture Mary and Joseph as a couple in love who chose each other freely. We read about betrothal and assume it was something like an engagement, a formality before the real commitment. It wasn't. What was marriage in the world Jesus walked through? What forces shaped it? Who made the decisions? What happened to a woman if something went wrong? What did a man risk when he took a wife? And what did it mean, really mean, when Joseph decided not to expose Mary publicly, or when Jesus turned water into wine at a wedding feast that was running out of something as ordinary as a drink? These aren't decorative questions. They cut to the bone of how this world actually worked. Stay until the end, because understanding this changes how we read the Gospels permanently. To understand marriage in the time of Jesus, you have to first understand the village, not as a concept, but as a physical place. A cluster of stone houses built close together on a hillside in Galilee, where the air in summer smells of dust, dried figs, and animal dung baking in the heat. Where the streets, if you can call them that, are narrow enough that two loaded donkeys can barely pass each other. Where sound travels easily, a mother scolding a child 3 houses away, a man sharpening a blade on stone, the low grinding of a hand mill at dawn before the light has fully come. In this world, privacy was almost non-existent. Houses shared walls. Courtyards were communal. Women drew water from the same well and knew, without needing to be told, what was happening in every household within walking distance. There were no secrets, or rather, secrets were not kept easily, and when they were broken, the damage was visible to everyone. This matters deeply when you begin to understand how marriage actually functioned here. A girl in first-century Jewish society, in Galilee, in Judea, in the villages and small towns where most people lived, did not choose her husband. That is not a small detail to gloss over. It was the structural reality of her existence from the time she was old enough to be considered marriageable, which by the standards of that world could be as young as 12 or 13 years of age. Her father held the legal and social authority over her marital future. He was the one who negotiated. He was the one who agreed. He was the one who received the mohar, the bride price, a payment from the groom's family that was not the purchase of a person, but a formal recognition of value, a compensation to the household for the loss of a daughter's labor and productivity. If you want to understand a practice, look at what it protected and what it assumed. The mohar assumed that a daughter was an economic and social asset to her family. It protected the family's honor by making the transaction formal and witnessed. It created obligation on both sides, and it initiated a process that was far more complex, far more laden with risk and consequence than anything our modern word engagement can contain. This process was called betrothal, and if you have been reading it as a simple promise between two young people, you have been reading a very different story. If this kind of content strengthens your understanding of Scripture and history, consider subscribing. This channel exists to bring these worlds back to life, one story at a time. Betrothal in first-century Jewish law was not a promise. It was a legal contract. Once a girl's father accepted the terms and the mohar was paid or formally promised, the girl was considered legally bound to the man. She was referred to as his wife, not his fiancée, not his girlfriend, not his intended, his wife. She did not yet live with him. The marriage had not yet been consummated. But in every legal and social sense, she belonged to that household. If the man died during the betrothal period, she was a widow. If she was found to have been with another man, the legal consequence was the same as adultery within a completed marriage. The contract was that binding. The betrothal period typically lasted about 1 year. During this time, the young woman remained in her father's house, continuing her daily work, grinding grain, weaving, caring for younger siblings, preparing food, carrying water. But her status had shifted entirely. She was watched more carefully now. The stakes were higher. Her body had become the site of family honor in a way that was both deeply personal and entirely public. And the young man, often not much older than she was, perhaps a craftsman, a farmer, a fisherman's son, was during this same year preparing the place where they would live. In most cases, this meant adding a room onto his father's house, literally building the space where his married life would begin. He could not bring his bride home until that space was ready, and that readiness was judged not by him, but by his father. Think about what this meant in practice. The beginning of a marriage depended on the quality of someone's stonework, on the availability of timber, on whether the harvest that season had been good enough to purchase materials, on whether a father decided his son had built well enough. The most intimate transition in a young person's life was tethered to the physical, the economic, the structural. Nothing in this world was romantic by accident. Everything was held inside a web of obligation, labor, honor, and negotiation. And the threads of that web were visible to every neighbor, every relative, every elder sitting near the gate of the village in the early evening. The morning a young woman in first-century Judea woke up knowing her betrothal had been formalized was not a morning of flowers and whispered promises. It was a morning of weight, not the weight of dread, necessarily, but the weight of reality settling into the bones. She understood, because she had watched her mother, her aunts, her older sisters. Exactly what this contract meant. It meant that her life, which had always been shaped by her father's household, would now be shaped by another man's household entirely. His mother would become the authority over her daily work. His family's rhythms would become her rhythms. His village, if he was from a different one, would become the only world she moved through. She brought with her a dowry, goods assembled by her father's family, sometimes linens, pottery, jewelry, small household items that represented her family's ability and dignity. These objects were hers in a specific legal sense. They belonged to her within the marriage, a form of security, a thread connecting her to her origin household. But they were also a statement. What a bride brought into a house told everyone. Neighbors, in-laws, the women at the well. Exactly what kind of family she came from. Too little, and the shame followed her like a shadow through the first years of her marriage. Honor and shame in this world were not abstract moral categories. They were lived, daily, material. They determined whether a woman was greeted warmly or coldly by her mother-in-law. They shaped whether her husband's sisters treated her as an equal or as a burden. They influenced whether she was given the better tasks or the hardest ones in the household's daily rotation of labor. And the labor was relentless. A married woman in a first-century Galilean household woke before the light. The hand mill, 2 heavy circular stones, the upper one turned by hand, was her first assignment of the day. Grinding enough grain for a family's bread required 30 minutes to an hour of sustained physical effort. The sound of it was the sound of morning itself in these villages, a low, rhythmic scraping that began in the darkness and continued until the flour was ready. Her arms ached. The stone was cold at first. Then the friction warmed it. Dust from the grain settled into her hair, her clothing, the creases of her hands. After the grinding came the fire. A small clay oven, often dome-shaped, fueled by dried dung, wood scraps, or thorny brush gathered by children. Bread was baked flat against the inside walls of the oven or on a curved clay surface set over the coals. Timing mattered. Too little heat, and the bread was raw at the center, dense and heavy. Too much, and it charred. Wasteful in a household where grain was budgeted carefully. A skilled woman produced bread that was consistent. An unskilled one, or one working under poor conditions, with wet fuel or a damaged oven, produced something that marked her, however quietly, in the eyes of those who ate it. This is the world in which Jesus spoke about yeast, about bread, about the woman who swept her whole house searching for a single lost coin. These were not decorative illustrations chosen for charm. They were the textures of the daily life surrounding him, the pressures and calculations and small victories of women who ran households on the edge of sufficiency. Water was another entire domain of labor. In most villages, water came from a central well or cistern, not from a source within the house. Carrying water meant walking, sometimes a considerable distance, with a heavy clay jar balanced on the head or carried on the hip. A family's daily water needs for drinking, cooking, and basic washing required multiple trips. This was typically women's work. And the well, as every reader of the Gospels eventually learns, was a social space as much as a practical one. It was where women met, where information moved, where status was visible in the quality of a woman's jar, the condition of her clothing, the confidence or timidity of her posture. When Jesus sat at the well in Samaria and spoke to a woman who came there alone, at midday, not in the cool morning when the other women came together, that detail was not incidental. Midday at the well meant she was avoiding the morning gathering. The reasons for that avoidance were written into her history, her reputation, her position within her community. Jesus was not simply resting by a roadside landmark. He was placing himself in a specific social geography, and every person who heard this story in the first century understood exactly what that geography meant. Back inside the household, the organization of space itself communicated everything about hierarchy and function. A typical village house in Galilee was modest by any standard. 1 or 2 rooms, stone walls, a packed earth or plastered floor, a roof of wooden beams covered with branches and sealed with clay. The ground-level area often housed animals at night. A donkey, a few goats, perhaps sheep. Their body heat helped warm the space in cold seasons. The smell was constant and unremarkable to those who lived there, part of the texture of the house itself, as natural as the smell of the cooking fire. The sleeping and living area was slightly elevated, sometimes just a few inches above the animal area, sometimes on a low platform. This separation was functional, not merely symbolic. A lamp placed on a stand in this elevated area, as Jesus described in his teaching, truly could give light to the entire house. Because the house was small enough, open enough, that a single flame was sufficient to see by from one end to the other. Marriage brought a woman fully into this physical world. She was now responsible for it. The maintenance of the oven, the replenishment of water, the management of food stores, the care of children and animals and the sick. All of this fell within her domain, and the quality of her management was visible to everyone inside the household and to many outside it. And yet, And this is something that often disappears in our reading. She had real authority within this domain. Not political authority, not the ability to own property independently or testify in most courts, but within the household, a competent wife held genuine power. She knew where everything was. She knew how much grain remained in the storage jars. She knew which child had a cough developing and which one was running a fever. She knew which neighbor could be trusted to lend oil and which one would ask for repayment in a way that created obligation. The woman who lost her coin and swept her entire house in Jesus' parable was not a passive figure. She was a woman who knew exactly what she had, knew immediately when something was missing, and took systematic action to recover it. The celebration she called her neighbors to share was real, because the loss had been real. In a household economy where every small object held value, a single coin was not trivial. It was a day's wage, a week's security, a link in a chain of sufficiency that could not afford many missing links. This was the interior world of marriage as it was lived. Not romance, not sentiment, but competence, endurance, authority within constraint, and the daily work of keeping a household alive and dignified. There was a moment, and every family in first-century Judea knew it was coming, had prepared for it, had dreaded and anticipated it in equal measure, when the betrothal period ended and the groom came to bring his bride home. This was not a quiet moment. It was not a private one. The procession was the marriage, not the contract, not the mohar payment, not even the betrothal ceremony itself. The procession through the streets of the village, with torches and singing, and the sound of flutes cutting through the night air, was the public declaration that transformed legal status into lived reality. The whole community witnessed it. The whole community participated in it, or was expected to. To be absent from a wedding procession without reason was a social statement, a form of coldness that was remembered. The timing of this procession was typically at night. Torchlight, the smell of burning oil, the warm, flickering glow moving through narrow stone streets. This was the image every person in Jesus' audience carried in their mind when he told the parable of the 10 virgins. 10 young women, waiting with lamps for the bridegroom to arrive. 5 had brought extra oil. 5 had not. We read that parable today and focus immediately on its theological meaning. And it carries one deeply. But before the theology, there is the sociology, the archaeology of a single evening. The bridegroom's arrival time was uncertain. This was not carelessness. It was structural. The groom could not leave for his bride's house until his father gave permission, and that permission came only when the father judged that everything was ready. The room prepared, the household in order, the timing right. No young man could tell his waiting bride exactly when he would arrive, because he himself did not know. He was not the one who decided. So the women waiting with their lamps were waiting in genuine uncertainty. An hour, 2 hours, perhaps most of the night. The oil in a small clay lamp, a simple shallow dish with a wick of twisted flax floating in olive oil, burned for a limited time. A lamp filled to capacity might burn for 2 or 3 hours before the oil was gone and the flame sputtered out. To wait through a long night required planning. It required extra oil carried in small flasks or jars, the kind of practical foresight that distinguished a prepared attendant from an unprepared one. When the cry went up at midnight, "Here is the bridegroom, come out to meet him," it was not simply a signal to start celebrating. It was the moment that separated those who had prepared from those who had not. The 5 who had no extra oil faced a specific, humiliating reality. They could not participate in the procession. To walk in darkness, without a lamp, was not merely inconvenient. It was socially impossible. The torchlit procession was a public demonstration of honor, of belonging, of readiness. A woman walking in it without light was not participating. She was a disruption. Their request to borrow oil was refused, not out of cruelty, but out of practicality. If the 5 prepared women shared their oil, all 10 lamps would go dim before the procession reached its destination. The prepared ones could not sacrifice their readiness for those who had failed to prepare. The door that closed while the unprepared 5 went to buy oil was not a metaphor invented for theological effect. It was a real door, in a real house, shut against latecomers, because the celebration had already moved inside and the household had closed itself to the night. Now feel the weight of that closed door in a village where everyone knew everyone. To be shut out of a wedding was a social wound. It would be spoken of. It would be remembered. The shame of arriving late, of being unprepared, of standing outside a shut door while music and voices drifted through the walls. That shame was not abstract. It lived in the body, in the face, in the eyes of neighbors who had been inside and would remember who was not. Jesus was not reaching for exotic imagery when he told this story. He was describing something his listeners had seen, or feared seeing, or had experienced in some form. The emotional texture of the parable was immediate and visceral to anyone who had ever waited with a lamp, ever worried about oil, ever stood outside a celebration unsure of their place within it. The wedding feast itself, once the procession arrived and the household opened its doors, was one of the most significant social events a village experienced. Weddings lasted days, typically 7 days for a first marriage. This was not extravagance for its own sake. It was obligation. The entire network of family, neighbors, and community relations was activated. People came from other villages. Old obligations were renewed. New ones were created. Food and drink were provided by the groom's family, and the sufficiency of that provision was a direct measure of the family's honor and capacity. Running out of wine was not a minor embarrassment. In the village culture of first-century Galilee, a family that failed to provide adequately for its wedding guests had failed publicly, in front of everyone whose opinion shaped their social standing for years to come. Debts of hospitality in this world were tracked carefully. If you came to my son's wedding and I fed you well, you owed a return of equivalent generosity when your own household celebrated. If I failed to provide, I had broken something in the web of reciprocal obligation that held the community together. When the wine ran out at Cana, Mary's quiet statement to Jesus, "They have no wine," was not small talk. It was an alert about an unfolding social crisis. A family was on the verge of a failure that would be remembered and discussed for a long time. The servants who filled the stone jars with water, who drew from them and carried the result to the master of the banquet, were not performing a symbolic act in isolation from real consequence. They were participants in the resolution of a genuine crisis of honor. Those 6 stone jars deserve attention on their own terms. They were not decorative vessels. They were purification jars, large, heavy, carved from stone rather than formed from clay, precisely because stone, unlike clay, did not absorb impurity and therefore did not need to be ritually cleansed itself. Each jar held between 20 and 30 gallons. 6 of them, filled to the brim, represented somewhere between 120 and 180 gallons of liquid. The scale of this is important. This was not a quiet, intimate gesture. This was an overwhelming abundance. Far more wine than the wedding needed, produced from water, presented to a banquet master who tasted it and could not understand why the best wine had been saved for last. The comment he made to the groom was a social observation wrapped in genuine bewilderment. Custom dictated that the best wine came first, when palates were fresh and guests were attentive. Lesser wine followed when attention had softened. Whoever had arranged this feast had broken the logic of hospitality as everyone understood it, and no one at the banquet knew what had happened. No announcement was made. No miracle was proclaimed. The servants knew. Mary knew. The disciples who were present knew. And the family whose honor had quietly been rescued from collapse. They benefited without yet understanding the source of their rescue. This is how Jesus moved through the world. Not with announcements, not with demonstrations designed for spectacle, but with presence inside the actual pressures and textures of the lives surrounding him. There is one more dimension of marriage in the world of Jesus that cuts deeper than wedding processions and stone jars of wine. It is the dimension that lived in silence, in whispered conversations between women at the well, in the careful avoidance of certain topics in mixed company. It is the dimension of what could go wrong and what the consequences looked like when it did. Divorce in first-century Jewish society was a legal mechanism available almost exclusively to men. This was not a matter of cultural preference. It was embedded in the interpretation of Torah, specifically in the book of Deuteronomy, which permitted a man to write a certificate of divorce and send his wife away if he found in her something he considered objectionable. The debate among Jewish legal scholars of Jesus' time was not whether divorce was permissible. It was about what constituted sufficient grounds. Two major schools of thought framed this debate with precision. The school of Shammai held that divorce was permissible only in cases of serious sexual immorality, a narrow, strict interpretation that protected women from being dismissed for trivial reasons. The school of Hillel took a considerably broader view, permitting divorce for a wide range of causes, including something as minor as burning a husband's food. Or, in the most expansive interpretation attributed to this school, simply because a man found another woman more attractive. The distance between these two positions was the distance between a woman's security and her vulnerability. A divorced woman in this world did not simply return to her previous life and begin again. The certificate of divorce she received, the get, written in formal Aramaic, witnessed and handed to her directly by her husband, was a document that freed her to remarry, but it could not restore what divorce had cost her. Her position in the community had shifted. Her father's household, if her parents were still living, might take her back. But she returned as a burden, as a woman whose marriage had failed, as someone whose story now required explanation in every future negotiation. If her parents were dead, or her brothers unwilling, her situation became genuinely precarious. Widowhood carried its own weight, but it carried no stigma. A widow was a woman visited by loss. A divorced woman, in the social imagination of this world, was a woman who had been found wanting, even when the reason for the divorce was trivial, even when the fault was entirely her husband's, even when the certificate in her hands was the result of nothing more than a man's change of preference. This was the social terrain Jesus stepped into when the Pharisees came to him with their question about divorce. The question they brought him was not innocent. It was constructed. Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any cause? The phrase, "for any cause," was a direct reference to the Hillelite position, the broad interpretation that had become common in practice. They were asking Jesus to position himself within an existing debate, to commit to one school's reading over another's, to make himself either a conservative restrictor or a permissive accommodator. Jesus did neither. He went behind the schools entirely, behind Deuteronomy, behind the legal framework, to the beginning, to the moment of creation. From the beginning it was not so. He refused to be caught inside the terms of a debate that had already accepted too narrow a frame. The question was not which grounds were sufficient for divorce. The question was what marriage was for, what it meant, what human reality it expressed and protected. And then he said something that stopped everyone in the conversation. He said that a man who divorced his wife, except for sexual immorality, and married another committed adultery, and that a man who married a divorced woman committed adultery. Feel what this meant to the people hearing it. In a world where a man could hand his wife a certificate and walk away from their marriage because she had burned his bread, Jesus was saying that the ease of that act did not erase its moral weight. The legal mechanism did not cleanse the human damage. The certificate was a piece of papyrus. The woman's life, her security, her children's stability, her place in the community, these were not pieces of papyrus. They were real, and the decision to dissolve them required a reckoning that no legal formula could bypass. His disciples, hearing this, were shaken. If this is the situation between a husband and wife, they said among themselves, it is better not to marry. The response itself reveals how radical Jesus' position felt to men who had grown up in a world where divorce was an available tool, one they had assumed they would always have access to if things became difficult. Jesus was not making marriage harder in the abstract. He was making it more honest. He was insisting that the commitment be what it claimed to be. Now return to the beginning of this story, to Joseph, standing in the darkness of his own anguish. Mary is betrothed to him. She is legally his wife, though she has not yet come to live in his house. And she is pregnant. The child is not his. In the framework of the law, Joseph had not merely the option, but arguably the social obligation to expose this publicly. A woman found to be unfaithful during betrothal could, under the most severe application of the law, face consequences that included public humiliation and, in earlier periods, death by stoning. Even in the more moderate practice of Joseph's time, public exposure meant complete social destruction. Mary's name, her family's name, the child, all of it would be consumed by the shame of a public accusation. Joseph decided not to do this. Matthew's Gospel describes him as a righteous man, tzaddik, in the Hebrew moral vocabulary, who did not want to disgrace her and who planned to divorce her quietly. Two words bound together in apparent contradiction, righteous and merciful. In the legal framework of his world, righteousness might have demanded exposure. Joseph chose a different kind of righteousness, one that absorbed personal dishonor rather than inflicting public destruction on a woman whose situation he did not yet understand. He had made his decision in the dark before the angel came, before he knew about the Holy Spirit, before the dream, before the words, "Do not be afraid." In the silence of his own confusion and grief, he had already decided to protect her. This is not a small detail tucked into the nativity story for narrative texture. It is a window into the specific moral courage that this world required of its people. The courage to absorb shame rather than distribute it. To choose quiet mercy over public vindication. To carry privately what the law permitted you to throw publicly onto another person. The world Jesus grew up in was shaped by people like Joseph, by women like Mary, who carried an impossible situation through 9 months of pregnancy in a village where every neighbor's eyes were sharp and every whispered conversation carried weight. By the unnamed women who swept their houses for lost coins, who waited through the night with carefully tended lamps, who ground grain in the darkness before dawn, and baked bread in clay ovens, and carried water on their heads up dusty paths, and kept households alive through the sustained labor of unremarkable days. Marriage in the time of Jesus was not a fairy tale. It was a covenant made inside a world of genuine risk, genuine consequence, genuine honor at stake. It was built from stone, literally, in the rooms young men added to their fathers' houses, and from the daily choices of people who had very little margin for error and who understood, with a clarity we have largely lost, how much depended on faithfulness. When Jesus spoke about marriage, about divorce, about the man who builds his house on rock rather than sand, about the bridegroom coming in the night, about the woman who searches until she finds, he was not speaking from a distance. He was speaking from inside this world, from within the texture of its pressures and its tenderness, its strictness and its mercy. He knew what a certificate of divorce cost a woman. He knew what it meant to wait with a lamp through a long, uncertain night. He knew what wine running out at a wedding could do to a family's standing in a village, where standing was everything. He knew what it meant for a man to choose quiet mercy over public righteousness, because he had grown up in the house of a man who had made exactly that choice. The faith that emerges from this world is not soft. It is not sentimental. It is made of the same material as everything else in first-century Judea: stone and oil and grain and water, and the low grinding sound of the hand mill before dawn. It is a faith that understands cost and commitment and the particular kind of courage required to honor what you have promised when everything around you makes breaking the promise the easier path. That is the truth about marriage in the time of Jesus, and it changes everything about how we read the stories he told.